The morning my daughter-in-law Amber Parrish went into labor, I drove 45 minutes through February sleet to reach the Queensway Carleton Hospital with my arms full. And my heart so full I thought it might simply stop from the weight of it all. I had a quilt folded over one arm. Cornflower blue and cream, each square hand-stitched over 4 months of evenings, and a basket of things I'd been collecting since the moment they announced the pregnancy. A tiny stuffed bear, a silver cup engraved with my late husband Clifford's initials, and a photograph I'd had reprinted and framed showing my son Brett at 2 days old, sleeping against my shoulder in the maternity ward of this very same hospital, 34 years earlier. I remember checking my reflection twice in the elevator mirror. Not because I cared about impressing anyone. But Amber had a way of noticing things, my coat, my shoes, my hair, and saying nothing out loud while saying everything with her eyes. I'd learned to check myself before I walked into her spaces. When the elevator doors opened on the 4th floor, Brett Parrish was already standing in the hallway. He'd clearly been waiting for me. That should have told me something. Mom. His voice was careful. He kissed my cheek, but his eyes moved sideways toward the closed door of room 412. Amber's resting. Of course she is. I won't stay long, sweetheart. I just want to see. We think it's better if you give her a few hours. She's really tired. I nodded. I understood tired. I understood all kinds of tired. Then I heard from behind the closed door the distinct sound of laughter, warm, easy laughter, and I recognized the voice immediately. It was Amber's mother, Sybil Coulter. I stood in that hallway for a moment longer than I should have, holding a quilt I had stitched every evening for 4 months, while Brett's voice continued explaining things I was no longer hearing. The words washed past me, because everything I needed to understand had already arrived, quietly and completely. Amber wasn't resting. Amber was laughing with her mother in room 412, and I was standing in the hallway. I drove home through the sleet. I sat in my own driveway for 20 minutes without going inside. Then I checked my phone and found the birth announcement already posted to Amber's Instagram. The first photograph showed my son holding a pink-wrapped baby while Amber smiled up at him from the hospital bed. The second showed Sybil cradling my granddaughter, eyes closed, enormous smile. The image of a grandmother receiving what grandmothers receive. There were dozens of photographs. Comments were already pouring in. Beautiful family. She has your eyes, Amber. So precious. I scrolled through every image. I was not in a single one. My name is Georgina Parrish, and I have spent most of my adult life putting other people first. Quietly, without announcement, in the way women of my generation were taught to love. When my husband Clifford died of a stroke 16 years ago, Brett was 18 years old and had just been accepted to study architecture at the University of Waterloo. Clifford had been the one with the pension plan, the one who understood our mortgage, the one who handled the filing cabinet where all the important papers lived. I was a pharmacist who worked steady hours and came home and cooked dinner and thought we had time. We didn't have time. The weeks after Clifford's funeral are not something I can describe cleanly. I remember managing. That's the word my neighbor Delphine Okafor used when she came by with food that first week. You're managing beautifully, Georgina. I hated that word for years. Managing meant surviving without anyone seeing the cost. Brett was extraordinary during those months, 18 years old, and he would come home on weekends from his first semester at Waterloo to mow the lawn, to sit with me at the kitchen table while I tried to understand the difference between the kinds of insurance Clifford had left behind. He never complained. He made me tea I didn't drink. He slept in the house without being asked because he knew the silence was too large. I paid his tuition in full, both degrees, the undergraduate, then the graduate program in Vancouver. I told him not to take loans. I meant it as a gift and he received it as one. When he moved back to Ottawa for a position at a firm downtown, I helped him furnish his apartment. When he met Amber at a colleague's engagement party and called me from the sidewalk. Afterward, voice lit up in that particular way. I hadn't heard since Clifford was alive. I felt something release in my chest. He deserved this, whatever this was. At first, I liked my daughter-in-law Amber very much. She was 31, worked in marketing for a pharmaceutical company, spoke with the kind of confident ease that I'd always admired in people who'd never had reason to doubt themselves. She called me Georgina from the start, not Mrs. Parrish. She asked intelligent questions about my career. She laughed at things that were actually funny, the first Christmas she spent at my house. She helped me wash up without being asked, and we talked for an hour at the kitchen sink about nothing in particular. And I drove her and Brett home, thinking, "Good! My son found something good." I should have paid closer attention to the early signs. They arrived quietly, as they always do with people who understand how to manage impressions. The first one came during a dinner the four of us had at a restaurant downtown. By then, Brett and Amber had moved in together, into an apartment I had helped furnish when the one they wanted required first and last, and a damaged deposit they didn't quite have. Amber's mother Sybil joined us that evening. Sybil was a woman who wore her wealth the way some people wear perfume, applied heavily and at all times. She worked in real estate, drove a German car, and had opinions about neighborhoods. That evening, she mentioned a mutual acquaintance whose kitchen renovation had gone over budget. "Some people," Sybil said pleasantly, "simply haven't refined their taste yet." She glanced at me once when she said it. I don't know if it was intentional. I chose to believe it wasn't. But I noticed the way Amber straightened slightly in her chair when her mother spoke. And I noticed the way Brett noticed it too, and stayed quiet. The wedding cost more than I had planned. Not because I was asked outright. Because Brett came to me one Sunday morning and said Amber had her heart set on a venue in the Gatineau Hills, a certain caterer, a certain photographer, and the numbers came out to something I won't name here. Only to say it was more than Clifford and I had spent on the house. I paid it. I told myself I was doing what Clifford would have wanted. I told myself they were young. And this was the beginning of their life, and beginnings mattered. I was very good at telling myself things. After the wedding, the expenses arrived with more regularity and less ceremony. There was a condo. They needed help with the down payment. There was the trip to Portugal they couldn't quite afford, but had already half booked. There were conversations that started with, "Mom, we were wondering," and ended with numbers I agreed to while looking out my kitchen window, watching the neighbor's dog cross the yard, thinking about Clifford. After a while, I stopped even pretending I needed to think it over. I just said yes, because yes was easier than watching my son look ashamed, and because I had spent 16 years confusing ease with love. Amber seemed grateful in the early years. She sent thank you messages. She brought expensive candles when she visited. She told Brett, in my presence, how lucky he was to have such a generous mother. But something had shifted, the way light changes in a room before a storm. Slowly enough that you keep thinking it's fine, it's just a cloud, it will pass. The comments began after the move to the larger condo. Amber had started spending more time with Sybil, and when she came to my house, now her eyes moved around the rooms differently, measuring. My furniture was dated. My neighborhood was not what it used to be. She stopped suggesting we cook together and started suggesting restaurants I found difficult to afford on a pharmacist's pension. When I mentioned this once, gently, briefly, she laughed and said, "Georgina, you worry too much." That laugh was kind on the surface. Underneath it was something that made me feel small, like a chair someone has already decided they will eventually replace but hasn't gotten around to yet. Brett didn't notice, or he noticed and decided not to. When Amber became pregnant, I genuinely believed things would soften. I had seen it happen. Parenthood has a way of burning away the unnecessary parts of people, leaving something more essential. I began the quilt the same week they told me. I cleaned out the guest room in my house so it could become a proper nursery corner for visits. I ordered the silver cup engraved with Clifford's initials because I wanted our granddaughter to carry some part of him forward. I had imagined, in the particular way that grandmothers imagine things, a version of the hospital room where I would hold her for the first time and feel the weight of everything that had survived. I had no idea that a delivery room hallway in February would be where I finally understood what the past 3 years had actually been. 2 weeks after my granddaughter Sage was born, my financial advisor Rhonda Kim called me from her office on Bank Street. "Georgina," she said, "I need to go over some activity on the secondary account connected to your estate planning file." I assumed it was routine. It was not routine. Over the following 40 minutes, Rhonda walked me through a series of transfers I did not recognize. Transfers from an account that Brett had access to. One I had opened years ago for the purpose of supporting them during what I had imagined would be a temporary period of getting established. The account I had, without quite meaning to, continued treating as a kind of permanent safety net. The amounts weren't small. "There's a pattern here," Rhonda said carefully. "That suggests this account has been used as a primary funding source for lifestyle expenses over an extended period. Luxury purchases, renovation deposits, investment transfers I can't trace clearly." She paused. "I also want you to look at something." She sent a document to my email while we were still on the phone. I opened it. My signature appeared at the bottom of a loan authorization form I had never seen in my life. It took me several seconds to understand what I was looking at. Then it took me several more to understand that I understood it completely. My hands were steady. That surprised me. I had expected to shake. I called my lawyer, Howard Finch, from my car in the Rideau Center parking lot. Howard had been Clifford's lawyer originally and had stayed mine through 16 years of widowhood. He was the kind of man who delivered bad news without flinching and good news without celebration, which meant I always trusted what came out of his mouth. He listened to everything without interrupting once. When I finished, there were 3 seconds of silence. "Georgina," he said, "I want you to hear something very clearly. What you're describing is not a family misunderstanding." He came to my house that evening with printed documents and a calm he'd clearly put on intentionally, the way doctors do before difficult conversations. We sat at the dining table where Clifford and I used to do our taxes, and Howard laid out what he'd confirmed. The loan authorization bearing my signature had been submitted electronically 6 months prior. The signature had been generated from a scan. The account leverage was connected to a trust I had created in Brett's name as part of my estate planning. A trust I had never agreed to use as collateral for anything. "Was Brett involved?" I asked. Howard took a careful moment. "The authorization doesn't appear to have been created by Brett. The device and the access profile suggest otherwise. I need another day to confirm." I closed my eyes. There is no clean way to describe what it is to sit in your own dining room, in the house where you raised your child after burying your husband, and understand that someone in your family has forged your name to borrow against your future. What I can tell you is that the grief of it has nothing to do with money. The money is almost beside the point. What breaks open inside you is the knowledge that you were trusted so completely, loved so visibly, that someone decided it would be easy to exploit that love. And they were right. The next morning, I froze all authorized access to the accounts connected to Brett and Amber's household. Every call. Brett's first messages were confused, then worried. Then, within 6 hours, something harder. His calls slowed. Amber's began. She left 3 voicemails. In the first, she was controlled. In the second, her voice shook. In the third, she said things I will not repeat here, only that they included the word cruel and a sentence about how I was punishing an innocent baby for my wounded pride. I did not answer. On the 5th day, Brett called. He sounded like he hadn't slept since Tuesday. "Mom, I need to talk to you," not over the phone. They came to my house on a Thursday evening, which I had not expected. I had expected a restaurant. Somewhere neutral, somewhere they controlled the lighting and the exits. Instead, they arrived at my door. Amber, carrying baby Sage in a carrier on her chest, and for one unguarded moment when I saw that small face, my granddaughter, 6 weeks old, alert and frowning at the hall light. I almost opened everything back up, just from her. But I had spent the night before preparing myself. I sat in this same dining room and prepared myself the way I used to prepare for the hard conversations after Clifford died, the ones with accountants and lawyers and people who needed me to be clear-headed when all I wanted was to lie down somewhere dark and quiet. We sat in the living room, and it began the way these things always begin, with the appearance of reasonableness. Brett said he knew things had been complicated. He said emotions were high. Amber sat across from me with Sage in her arms and said she hoped we could move forward as a family. I waited. Then Amber said it. We have significant fixed costs right now, Georgina. The condo fees, the line of credit. We can't absorb all of this without your help. Sage needs stability. Not we need stability. Sage needs stability. I looked at my son. Brett, do you know the full state of your household finances? He shifted in his chair. Amber handles most of the day-to-day. Do you know the actual state of your accounts? He said he knew the general picture. I set Howard's summary on the coffee table between us. Amber reached for it before Brett did. I watched her read it. I watched the exact moment she understood what it contained. Where did you get this? Her voice was measured in a way that told me she was concentrating hard on keeping it that way. Rhonda Kim's office. A silence that had weight to it. And this document. I placed the loan authorization beside Howard's summary, the one with my signature. Brett picked it up. He read it slowly. Then he read it again, the way people do when they're hoping the words will rearrange themselves into something less damaging. Amber, his voice was different now. What is this? Amber set Sage down in the carrier on the cushion beside her, folded her hands and said, in a voice composed beyond what the situation warranted, I can explain the context. She offered a version of events in which everything had been done with good intentions, in which the numbers were different from what they appeared, in which I had always been a difficult personality who made ordinary financial arrangements feel larger than they were. I listened to all of it. My phone sat face down on the arm of the chair beside me. Recording. At one point, Brett turned to her and said quietly, Amber, is that my mother's signature? She didn't answer directly. She said it was complicated. She said his mother had always made things harder than they needed to be. She said perhaps everyone needed to take a breath before this conversation went somewhere irreversible. I stood up. I said calmly that I thought we'd covered everything useful for one evening. I showed them out. I closed the door. Then I sat down at the kitchen table and did not move for a very long time. The legal process moved more quickly than I expected. Howard filed formal documentation the following week. The forgery finding was confirmed within 10 days. The accounts were reviewed. The picture that emerged was, in Howard's careful language, more significant than initially indicated. A pattern of leveraging my trust assets over 18 months, moving funds between accounts, using credit instruments Amber had opened in both their names without Brett's full knowledge. I need to say something here because I know what some of you are thinking. You're thinking Brett must have known. You're thinking no one is that unaware of their own household. What I can tell you is that obliviousness can be carefully constructed. Amber had handled every financial detail from the first year of their marriage. She was the one with the spreadsheets, the one who paid the bills, the one who filed their taxes and attended to the online banking and explained. When Brett asked general questions, that everything was fine. They were building towards something. It took time. Brett designed buildings for a living. He trusted her with numbers the way I had trusted Clifford, the way people who love each other sometimes divide the world too cleanly into what each person is supposed to handle. It does not excuse his absence, but it explains it. He found out about the extent of it in stages across several weeks in March, and each new layer of information took something from him that I watched disappear in real time. He came to my house on a Sunday morning in early April and sat at my kitchen table and put his face in his hands. He was 34 years old, and he looked like he was 18 again, sitting across from me in the weeks after Clifford died, trying very hard not to come apart. I didn't see it, he said. I poured him coffee. No. I should have. Yes, I said, you should have. He looked up. I think he expected me to soften it. I didn't. I also, I said carefully, should have said no years earlier. Not to you, to the pattern. I kept giving without conditions and called it love, and it wasn't entirely love. Some of it was fear. Fear that if I stopped providing things, you would love me less. The silence that followed that sentence was the most honest one we'd had in years. There was more beyond the finances. Rhonda, reviewing the full account history, found a series of transfers that didn't connect to any household expense she could identify. Howard investigated further. What emerged was that Amber had been routing a portion of funds into an account connected to another name. A man named Craig Mouton, who worked in her firm's Toronto office, and with whom, it became clear from the documentation, she had been maintaining a relationship for some time. I told Brett on a Wednesday evening. He already half suspected. Sutton! Some part of him had been carrying the weight of not knowing for longer than he'd allowed himself to admit. He didn't speak for several minutes. Then he said, "She brought him to the baby shower, Mom." He was there. I shook his hand. There was nothing I could say to that. He moved out of the condo in May. He took what was his and arrived at my door with 3 suitcases, and Sage in a car seat and an expression I recognized. The face of someone who has finished a version of their life and is not yet sure what comes next. I had made up the guest room. I had bought a proper crib the week before without saying anything about it. Healing is not a process that announces itself. There is no morning when you wake up and feel finished with grief, finished with anger, finished with the particular exhaustion of having been used by someone you loved. What there is, instead, is a series of ordinary moments that accumulate slowly into something that begins to feel like solid ground. Delphine came for dinner in June, and the 3 of us sat on the back deck while Sage lay on a blanket in the grass, batting at the air with her small fists in the focused way that very young babies approach everything, as though every movement is an important experiment. Delphine, who had known me since the year after Clifford died, watched Brett carry Sage inside when the mosquitoes arrived, and then looked at me and said, quietly, "He's going to be all right." I said I hoped so. "And you?" I thought about it, honestly, the way you can with someone who has known you long enough that pretending is just exhausting. I said I thought I was learning something I hadn't understood before, that love without accountability isn't love, it's management, that I'd spent 16 years managing things, managing Brett, managing my grief, managing the appearance of being fine, and somewhere in all that managing, I had confused providing with parenting. That there is a version of generosity that is actually a way of keeping people close by making yourself indispensable. And I had been practicing that version for longer than I wanted to admit. Delphine didn't offer a tidy response. She just nodded. That's why I love her. The legal proceedings surrounding the fraud took the better part of the year. The forged signatures were submitted to the Crown. Documentation moved through the system in the slow, methodical way that legal processes do when no one is in a hurry except you. At the end of it, Amber faced charges that resulted in a formal conviction and a restitution order. There were consequences, real ones, the kind that follow a person and change the shape of a life. I won't pretend I didn't feel something complicated when it concluded. There is a part of you, when you have been deeply wronged, that wants justice to look a certain way and feels unsatisfied when it looks like paperwork instead. But justice and satisfaction are not the same thing, and I have made my peace with that distinction. Brett and I had difficult conversations that year, real ones, not managed ones, about his choices, about my enabling, about the ways we had both participated in building something fragile and called it a family. He accepted accountability in ways that surprised me. He attended counseling and did not treat it as something to complete and set aside. He showed me his bank statements once a month for 6 months. Not because I asked, but because he said he needed the practice of being transparent about money with someone who would actually hold him to it. He also, on a Tuesday evening in October, with Sage asleep upstairs and snow beginning outside the window, sat across from me at the kitchen table and said, "Mom, the hospital, room 412. I waited. I should have come out to that hallway and brought you in myself. I knew something was wrong. I told myself Amber was overwhelmed, that her mother's presence was just easier for her right then, that I didn't want to create conflict 2 hours after our daughter was born. I chose the easier path. I left you standing there with that quilt." He stopped. "That's not good enough. I'm sorry." He said it without any of the qualifications and explanations I had learned to expect from that version of him. Just the words. I didn't tell him it was fine, because it wasn't fine. I told him I heard him. I told him that was a beginning. There is one moment I come back to when I think about what healing actually felt like, in its smallest and most specific form. November, the year Sage turned 9 months old. Brett and Sage and Delphine and I were in my living room on a Sunday afternoon, while the first snow of the season came down steadily outside. Brett had gone to the kitchen to make tea. Sage was on the rug, working very seriously on the project of crawling, which she had not yet mastered and which she appeared to find deeply unfair. She made a sound of frustration and looked up, and her eyes found mine, and she reached toward me with both arms the way babies do, without strategy, without memory, without any knowledge of the hallway in February, or the parking garage, or the months of paperwork or the evenings I had spent at this table, trying to understand how love and exploitation had lived so comfortably in the same house for so long. I lifted her and held her against my chest. The quilt was still folded in the hall closet, the cornflower blue one, the one I had carried into a hospital and carried back out again untouched. I had washed it in September. I planned to give it to Sage when she was old enough to understand that some gifts take longer to arrive than others, and that this does not make them less meant. Brett appeared in the doorway with 2 mugs. He saw me holding her and stood there for a moment without speaking. Then he smiled. The real one, the one that reaches the eyes and doesn't perform anything. She likes it there, he said. I know, I said. She gets that from her grandmother. Outside, the snow kept coming down over Ottawa in the quiet, unhurried way it does when it means to stay. And inside, in the warm and ordinary light of my living room, the 3 of us. 4. Counting Delphine, who had fallen asleep in the armchair with a book on her chest, simply existed together without any of it needing to be anything other than what it was. I have learned things I wish I hadn't needed to learn. I have learned that generosity, extended without limits, can become a kind of harm, even when that is the very last thing you intend. I have learned that the most loving thing a mother can sometimes do is allow her child to feel the full weight of the ground shifting beneath them. Not to punish, but because some lessons can only be learned that way, and postponing them is not the same as preventing. I have learned that healing between 2 people who have genuinely hurt each other does not look like a closing of wounds. It looks like an agreement to keep them clean. If there is someone listening to this tonight who has been sitting with the feeling I sat with in that hospital parking lot in February, the feeling of being erased from the family you gave everything to build, I want you to know something. That feeling is real, and you are allowed to respond to it. Love is not an agreement to absorb whatever is done to you and keep smiling. Love is also sometimes the hard and necessary work of refusing to participate in your own disappearance. You are not the difficult one for having a limit. You are simply someone who finally found it. If this story stayed with you, I would love to hear from you in the comments. Have you ever had to choose between keeping the peace and keeping your dignity? And if you're a grandparent, what would you have done standing in that hallway with a quilt and a photograph and the sound of someone else's laughter coming through a closed door? Tell me where you're watching from tonight. I read every comment, and more often than not, what you share stays with me long after the words on the screen are gone.